Well, I really hope that you are extra hungry this morning. Not just because a rumbling stomach might help keep you awake during a sermon that, despite what I consider to be relatively brief, will probably strike you as too long, but because today God's people are being treated to a party-sized, appetite-satiating sandwich. It won't be delivered by Uber Eats from Jersey Mike's or even Jimmy John's, but rather it comes from the evangelist Mark, who is actually quite renowned for his masterful use of the literary device of making sandwiches. Didn't know that, did you? Acknowledged by biblical scholars as the great interpolator. He is, in fact, perhaps most deserving of being referred to as the original sandwich artist, even though he constructs his not out of bread and meat and veggies, but by chopping up stories and putting them together in creative ways so that he can provide good news, the much-needed food for those who are starving for a word of hope. In his short 16-chapter book, we can find at least 8 different instances when he interrupts himself as he is telling a story by inserting another one into the middle of the conversation. On the menu for us this Sunday is maybe the best example of Mark's writing wizardry. Among the many stories he has inherited from the oral tradition are 2 that feature women who are desperately in need. He recognizes a strong connection between these 2 very different sufferers. So when he gets around to composing his gospel, he decides to weave them together in a way that makes them both more interesting and more satisfying than they would be if they were left to stand alone or even to follow one another sequentially. Mark, you see, is very much aware that he is writing to people who, not unlike us, are struggling to hang on to their faith. People whose spirits are being sickened more each day by having to find a way to keep going in a world of crumbling certainties in which the dark shadows only seem to be growing longer. They have been forced to confront decaying economic opportunity and continual political upheaval that no one in any leadership position seems to have the interest or ability to manage. They are, in short, folks who are at their wits' end. They hate what is happening, but they don't have a clue what to do to turn things around. They feel they have been pushed well beyond the limits of what should be possible for any one person to endure. Unable to cope with even a single thing more, they are ready to throw up their hands and scream, "What's the use? I give up." It wouldn't surprise me at all if you have been stuck for a time in that uncomfortable place, or if you are sensing we're all headed that way. Looks of hopelessness and frustration are no less common on the faces of those trying to cling to faith amongst us these days than they were for Mark's original audience. That's why the evangelist worked so hard to put together this sandwich of good news that could address this desperate condition. He doesn't want anyone to get to the point of giving up. And so he provides us with some assurance that all of the darkness in our world will not be able to stop the light from getting through. And he does that with his exceptional handling of these two stories that had come to his attention. Let's take a look at what he does with them. Throughout his gospel, Mark has Jesus moving at a frenzied pace. From the moment he launches his ministry, God's Son is always on the go. The evangelist is so intent on getting the Lord to his cross and resurrection that there is little time for thinking about the meaning of the multitude of things that are said and done along the way. The focus is persistently on what happens. Jesus acts, people react, and then Jesus gets back on the road, leaving everyone, including us, to wonder what we have seen, to say to ourselves, wait, what was that? To wonder if the Heavenly One just might be more present in the brokenness of our world than we had thought. But when we arrive at our text, something quite different takes place. Mark starts telling us a story of a 12-year-old girl who should have her whole life ahead of her, but is instead perched on the brink of death. Not that far removed from her first day on earth, she suddenly seems to be staring at her last. She is the beloved child of Jairus, a man of means and prestige, the leader of the synagogue, who is suddenly painfully aware that nothing on his resume is going to make a difference for his daughter. He is helpless, unable to do anything to save her. So in a last-ditch effort, he reaches out to Jesus for whatever aid he might render. On this occasion, however, before Jesus can do anything, there is an interruption. We are left in the lurch as the story we have been listening to abruptly stops and Mark starts up with another one. A second person intrudes upon the scene, also seeking the help of Jesus. On the other side of the years of full womanhood from that of the little girl, she has been suffering from a hemorrhage for the entire length of time Jairus' daughter had been alive. For 12 years, she has been slowly bleeding out. She's spent every cent she has trying to get it treated so that she could resume being an active participant in society instead of being regarded always as unclean. But after all her effort, she's bankrupt and in worse physical condition than she was before. In just as desperate straits as the daughter of Jairus, she too reaches out to Jesus for any help he could offer her. Precisely at this point, the usual unrelenting progress of this uniquely fast and furious gospel comes to a screeching halt. The storyline that had been moving so swiftly toward its anticipated conclusion is suddenly motionless, exhibiting the kind of stillness we associate with a breath being held, as this thoroughly depleted woman reaches out in exhaustion and disintegration and longing, not to take the arm of Jesus boldly, but rather to make fleeting contact with the barest knot of tassel on the fringe of his robe, hopefully without anyone being the wiser. But Jesus, feeling a discharge of his power, brings everything to a stop. And now, before we can move along to learn the fate of the daughter of Jairus, we are forced to pause so we can fully examine what is in the middle of the Markan sandwich. We are compelled to turn our attention to this other daughter of Israel, caught up in the grip of despair. Another person at the very end of her rope. Another of God's beloved children who is in peril of succumbing to the many wounds that can be inflicted by hopelessness. And we have to wonder, will we ever get to see a God who is indeed more present in the midst of our despair than we had thought? Is it still possible to hear in all its straight-up goodness the simple but true word we're hungry for? Can the light find a way to penetrate the darkness that is closing in around us? Check out what Jesus had to say. Mark puts a tender morsel of pure good news right in the center of his sandwich. The Word made flesh praises the woman for taking the risk of trusting him. And the result is that she is now healed and whole. He tells her to go and live a blessed life because she can forever be assured that God is present among his beloved people to heal every dis-ease that persists in trying to erode their well-being. God is there to overcome whatever would kill the ambition and hope of his children and force them to settle for anything less than resurrected life. And then to make sure that we don't miss this important message, Mark goes on to complete his sandwich, finally getting around to filling us in on the rest of the story of Jairus' daughter. While the action had been paused, it appears the girl had sadly lost her battle with her deadly illness. So when Jesus finally arrived at the family home, the formal mourning process was already well underway. Undeterred by the comments that suggested she was now past the point of any help from him, the Lord took her by the hand and invited her to rise up from her bed. And she too was blessed with the gift of new life. We all face those kind of moments that are critically important for us. Difficult times when we are at our wits' end, and all we can think of doing is to give up. Life in this world can do that to you. It can strike at you with unexpected maladies that threaten you with instantaneous death. or with others that are more relentless in their slow erosion of your wholeness. But in those moments when you find yourself most helpless to cope, the good news Mark brings today is that you will recognize Jesus is present with all of his mighty power to save, and all you need to do is reach out to him. No matter how thick the darkness might be these days, it can never stop his light from coming through to you. Amen.